2,000 years ago, on the eastern side of the Mediterranean Sea, a teacher named Jesus of Nazareth went up onto a hillside and addressed a large crowd. It was a crowd of nobodies.
Poor and sick people.
Their land occupied by the Roman Empire, who charged heavy taxes. This is a ragtag group. And while they don't look like much, Jesus claimed that something surprising was starting with them. So he opened his mouth and said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of the skies." The kingdom of the skies. What does that mean? Well, Jesus uses this phrase to talk about a new kind of reality. From our perspective, we see a world of violence and corruption whose might makes right. But for Jesus, there is a realm where generosity reigns, where there's justice and peace. It's a world where love is the final word. And that reality might as well be up in the skies. It's beyond us. Exactly. It's God's heavenly reality, which might seem far off. But Jesus was claiming that heaven was coming to earth, right here and now, beginning with these people.
That's unexpected.
And so is what he says next.
Blessed are those who grieve, for they will be comforted.
So this group that's at the bottom of society, they know all about loss and grief. But Jesus said something's coming that's going to turn sorrow into joy. And then he said, "Blessed are the unimportant, for they will inherit the land." And these people are not powerful or important, but just wait, Jesus says, because one day it will be you all who are ruling the world. You know, it kind of sounds like Jesus is trying to start a revolution. Kind of, but it's not a revolution for those who are hungry for power or influence. This is a movement of people who are going to serve because they long for healthy relationships between people and communities and nations. Yeah, as Jesus puts it next. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. They will be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Just imagine a group of powerless nobodies ruling the world through generosity and forgiveness and justice. This is a Jesus-style revolution. The next thing Jesus says is, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." And this one really raises the bar. To be part of this revolution, my heart needs to be so pure I could look directly at God. Well, Jesus knows that all of our choices, even our good ones, are often driven by mixed motives. For Jesus, real peace is only possible through people who know that they need to be transformed if they're going to truly love God and others. And this sounds wonderful, but it's a radical calling. That's exactly right. In fact, Jesus goes on to explore just how radical it is. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. So God's new reality won't just happen by itself. It requires people who are willing to enter into the conflicts of others, urging and helping create a way towards peace. But that way of life can be dangerous. And so Jesus says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of the skies." Yeah, entering into conflicts and advocating for peace, that's not a comfortable way to live. And so Jesus calls people to this peacemaking revolution, and he names the high cost. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in the skies is great, for they persecuted the prophets who were before you in the same way. What does that mean, the prophets before you? Well, Jesus and this whole crowd are Israelites. And in their Hebrew scriptures, God promised that it would be through Israel that his kingdom would be restored over all the world. But as the story goes, Israel becomes as corrupt and violent as everyone else. And they end up enslaved to oppressive nations. But Israel's prophets stood up to these kingdoms and criticized their corruption. They said that one day God's heavenly kingdom would break in, starting with a small group of Israelites who would be willing to surrender everything over to God. So Jesus wants this crowd to see that they're part of that legacy. Yes, and that's why Jesus concludes this first block of teaching with 3 images from their scriptures. The first is, "You are the salt of the land." Salt is a mineral that preserves food for a long time. And in the Bible, salt is used as a symbol of God's long-lasting covenant with Israel. Jesus is saying that he and this ragtag group are the launch party of God's long-lasting ancient promises to renew the world. And then Jesus says, You are the light of the world.
And a city on
A
a
hill cannot be hidden. He's referring to the biblical image of God's light, His presence shining out from its dwelling place in the temple in Jerusalem, which was a city on a hill. But these people, they aren't the rulers. I mean, they don't even live in Jerusalem. And yet, surprise, Jesus says, you all are God's salt and city and light. You all are the blessed ones, the new Jerusalem that's going to display God's kingdom to all the world. Most of his time was the poor and insignificant people of his day, and he claimed that God's rescue of the world was beginning through him and them. What was God rescuing the world from? Well, it's a rescue from the kind of world we've created by our selfishness and our contempt for others that leads to violence, and it's a rescue into communities of wholehearted love and respect. Jesus described this way of life by using an ancient biblical word, righteousness. A righteous person is someone who consistently does right by God and right by others. Jesus said, those who live this way are entering the kingdom of the skies. Okay, but life is messy. In any given situation, how are we even supposed to know what it means to do right by everyone? Yes, that is the question. So remember, Jesus was an Israelite, and the people of Israel had a specific answer to that question that was simple and profound. To do right by God and people, you need to learn God's wisdom. And how do you get God's wisdom? Well, for Israelites, you find God's wisdom by meditating on their scriptures, called the Torah and Prophets. The Torah, that's the first 5 books of the Bible. Right, in Hebrew, Torah means teaching, though it's often translated in our Bibles as the law. But these books aren't just laws. Right, the Torah is a story about God's plan to partner with humans in ruling the world. And when humans ruin that partnership through stupidity and violence, God begins a rescue plan. First, by choosing and then rescuing the Israelites, and then by inviting them into a covenant relationship. Right, the story of Moses on Mount Sinai. That's where they get all these commands to live by. Yeah. Now, after the Torah come the prophets, who continue the story. They show how Israel failed to live by God's wisdom by violating those commands. But they also wrote poetry about how that failure was not the end of the story. God was going to bring this partnership to its fulfillment. And for Jesus and his people, the Torah and the prophets, they reveal God's wisdom to anyone who will meditate on them day and night. Okay, but let's go back to all those commands. How do you find God's wisdom in an ancient law code? Yeah, totally. The laws in the Torah were ancient even to Jesus, given centuries earlier when the Israelites could live free on their own land. But in the time of Jesus, they were occupied by the Romans. They couldn't even follow many of the laws as originally stated. Okay, so that's a problem. And on top of that, the 613 laws in the Torah are not a comprehensive rule book. And so there arose teachers of the Torah called scribes and Pharisees, and they would fill in the gaps by discerning God's wisdom underneath the laws, so they could apply it to other areas of life. For instance, the Torah said Israelites should stop working 1 day a week. Right, but what counts as work? Well, the Torah doesn't actually give a full definition, and so the scribes would study the scriptures and provide a comprehensive list that people could live by. They're applying God's wisdom to everyday life so they can do righteousness before God and others. Right. Now, Israel's teachers didn't always agree with each other, and Jesus would often wade into these debates, sometimes agreeing and other times disagreeing with the scribes and Pharisees. And that would make them worry. Maybe Jesus doesn't take the Torah and the prophets seriously enough. And so Jesus responds to this concern in the Sermon on the Mount when he says, "Don't suppose that I've come to dismantle the Torah or the prophets. I haven't come to dismantle them, but to fill them full." What does that mean? That Jesus came to fill the Torah and prophets full? Well, remember, the scriptures tell the story about God's plan to partner with Israel and all humanity in ruling the world. And Jesus claimed that he was taking that story forward, showing how to be righteous and live by God's wisdom. That's quite a claim. Yes, Jesus even said that his vision of righteousness was more in line with God's wisdom than anyone else in his day. He said, "Unless your righteousness far surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you won't enter the kingdom of the skies." That's intense. It is. But as we'll see, Jesus is offering a bold and beautiful vision of human life. How to build healthy communities and heal broken relationships, and how to transform hostility into honor and respect. Which is great, but can you give me an example? Actually, Jesus is going to do just that in 6 case studies. Each time he'll quote a command from the Torah and then explain how it reveals God's wisdom, so that we can learn how to consistently love God and do right by our neighbor. If you've ever heard of Jesus of Nazareth, you probably know he was a famous teacher, and his most well-known words have shaped the lives of billions of people throughout history. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do to others what you would have them do to you. Now, those sayings come from a collection of Jesus' teaching that's sometimes called the Sermon on the Mount. It's only 3 chapters long, but its ideas and images have endured throughout time. You are the salt of the earth. You can't serve both God and money. Take the plank out of your eye before you take the speck out of another's. In the sermon are some really challenging teachings. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, turn and offer him the other cheek. Love your enemy and bless those who persecute you. And there are also some really puzzling teachings. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. But the Sermon on the Mount is not a random collection of Jesus' teachings. They've been organized in a beautiful way so that it's easier to remember and meditate on. There are 3 main parts of the sermon, the middle of which has 3 parts, and then each of those middle parts themselves have 3 parts. Wow, the sermon has been carefully designed. Yes, and right at the center of the center is the famous prayer that Jesus taught his followers. Our Father in heaven, may your name be treated as holy. May your kingdom come. May your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Well, what does that mean for God's kingdom to come on earth? Well, we have to remember that Jesus was Jewish, and he grew up meditating on the Hebrew Bible, the sacred scriptures of Israel. And they told the story of God and all humanity, how God created a well-ordered world and appointed humans to rule it on his behalf. And when humans rule with God's wisdom and love, and when justice and peace prevail and there's enough for everyone, that is God's kingdom and God's will being done here on earth as it is in heaven. And that's no easy task. Humans foolishly rebel and start building their own kingdoms by their own wisdom. And so God chose one family, the Israelites, and he offered them his wisdom. It was called the Torah, which in Hebrew means the teaching. And beginning with Moses on Mount Sinai, God entered into a sacred covenant with them. Why only select one family? Well, the goal was for the Israelites to be transformed by God's wisdom so that they could represent God's kingdom before all the nations. But in Jesus' day, God's kingdom was nowhere to be seen. In fact, Israel was under the thumb of Roman oppressors. So what happened? Why isn't God's kingdom coming? Well, many religious leaders, like the scribes and the Pharisees, they thought it wasn't coming because Israel wasn't being faithful enough to the Torah. Other leaders, called the Sadducees, thought it would be best if Israel found a way to cooperate with Rome, and so they became the power brokers of Jesus' day. Some ran for the hills to become freedom fighters against Rome. They're known as the Zealots. And still others withdrew to the desert, waiting for God to use them to start a new Israel. But walk around the hill country of Israel, like Jesus did, and you'll mostly find normal people, figuring out their lives as best they can. Most were barely hanging on. Lots of poor and sick people. Many had lost their land to the Roman occupiers and were struggling to pay the heavy taxes. They were powerless and hopeless. And so Jesus went to these people, healing the sick and announcing that God's kingdom was arriving. People gathered from all over to hear his teachings, and one day, Jesus went up to a tall hill and said the arrival of God's kingdom was starting here and now with them. You mean with the powerless, the weak, the nobodies? God's kingdom begins here? Yes, this is why the very first line of the Sermon on the Mount is, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." In other words, Where can you go and see God's presence and blessing springing to life? Among the rich? Among the powerful? No, Jesus says. Look where people are poor, where they feel crushed and defeated. God's kingdom is beginning with the people standing right here. Imagine a world where everyone treats each other with dignity and respect. And when problems do arise, everyone works hard to do right by each other. In the Bible, this way of treating each other is called doing righteousness. And it sounds great, but how are we supposed to know how to always do right by others? Well, Jesus, like any Israelite teacher, believed that you can learn righteousness through studying God's wisdom that's found in the ancient scriptures, the Torah and the prophets. So studying things like the laws that God gave ancient Israel. Exactly. Jesus believed that God's wisdom can be found within those laws if we meditate on them. Ancient laws can teach us how to do right by each other today? Yes. And let's watch how Jesus does it here in the Sermon on the Mount. So Jesus will first quote a command from the Torah, and then second, he'll reveal God's wisdom underneath the command. Okay, let's jump in. Alright, he starts with a pretty intense topic, murder. Jesus begins, "You have heard that it was said to the ancients, 'You shall not commit murder.'" He's quoting from the 10 Commandments here. "And I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be guilty in the court. And whoever says to his brother, 'You good for nothing,' will be guilty in the high court." Wait, so Jesus is equating anger and name-calling with murder? He got your attention, didn't he? Yeah, but obviously murdering someone is worse than just getting mad and calling someone a name. Sure, but that's not his point. Jesus is provocatively showing how murder, anger, and verbal abuse, they're all surface manifestations of something that is way deeper, which is how much you value or don't value someone's existence. I see. Like murder is the ultimate way of saying that someone's life doesn't matter. And so is losing your temper or belittling someone. These all reveal an attitude of superiority and contempt for the life of another person. It wreaks havoc in our relationships and communities, and it's worthy of serious consequences. So the wisdom of this command is about way more than just murder. For Jesus, this command is about treating everyone as valuable. Right. Jesus wants us to see that any time we demean or devalue other people, it's a failure to do right by them. His definition of righteousness means treating everybody as a fellow image of God. Okay, the next case study is about adultery. "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.'" Again, quoting from the 10 Commandments here. "And I say to you that everyone who keeps on staring at a woman in order to stir up sexual desire, he's already committed adultery with her in his heart." Okay, so Jesus isn't talking about merely finding someone attractive. No, he's talking about the long, creepy stare, objectifying someone, looking at them like they exist for your own pleasure. And when we do this, we are stripping a fellow human of their God-given dignity, even if we keep our hands to ourselves. In fact, this is so serious to Jesus, he goes on to say, if your eye or hand is causing you to sin, cut them off. I mean, really? Jesus was the master of hyperbole. I mean, he just said the real problem is in our hearts, not our eyes or our hands. But he's trying to make clear that the stakes are really high. Yeah, well, he succeeded. It's important to remember that Jesus was raised on the Hebrew scriptures, which portray sex as a beautiful thing. But if sexual desire is driving us to dishonor the image of God in others or in ourselves, if it's causing breakdown in our relationships, it's actually ruining us, and we need to do whatever it takes to deal with it. Well, this doesn't get any easier because the third case study is on divorce. Jesus says, "It has also been said, whoever sends away his wife, he must give her a certificate of divorce." Well, what's going on here? Sending away his wife? Yeah, in Jesus' day, only Israelite men could initiate a divorce, and that imbalance led to all kinds of problems. But divorce was allowed. It was, though only one law in the entire Torah addressed the issue, and Jesus just quoted from it. The law said that if a man initiates a divorce, he has to do it in the proper way and for a legitimate reason. Okay, so what's a legitimate reason? Well, this was actually a hot debate in Jesus' day. According to some Torah scholars, this law allowed for divorce only in the case of adultery. But other Torah scholars argued that the law allowed a man to divorce his wife for any reason, even dissatisfaction with the marriage. Okay, so here Jesus enters into that's a very specific debate. Right. Now, if a man could threaten divorce for any reason, that would make it easier for him to abuse his wife. And so to protect women, Jesus sided with those who limited legitimate divorce to cases of adultery. And he makes this clear when he says, "And I say to you, any man who sends away his wife, except for a case of sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery." Okay, and what does that mean? Makes her the victim of adultery. And Jesus is being provocative again, saying that if a man divorces his wife for an illegitimate reason, because he's tired of the marriage or just wants to be with somebody else, his marriage covenant is actually still intact. And that means that any new marriage is an act of adultery. Right. But notice, Jesus explicitly assigns blame to the men in his culture because it's their selfish choices that are forcing women into these vulnerable situations. And you can see how this could play out. In a society where only men can initiate divorce for any reason, this could normalize the oppression of women on a large scale. Totally. In his cultural context, Jesus' statement protects and elevates the dignity of women as images of God. But what about other ways a marriage covenant can be violated, like neglect or abuse? Would those be legitimate reasons for divorce? Yeah, those are really important questions that Jesus doesn't address. His focus here is on how this one debated divorce law in the Torah was being twisted and misused by the men of his day. How they were treating women like objects that could be discarded, like it's no big deal. But for Jesus, the marriage covenant is designed to create interdependence and mutual respect so that the two can reflect God's image together as one. And that leads us back to the main point of all three case studies. Jesus is showing how God's wisdom in these commands, it's aimed at our core desires and motivations that affect how we treat people. Someone could strictly follow these rules about murder, adultery, and divorce, but still dishonor and objectify people in other ways. Right. For Jesus, real righteousness and wisdom means treating every human like they have ultimate value. Yeah, if we valued others that much, imagine what kind of world we could create. And that's exactly what Jesus had in mind. His announcement about the arrival of God's heavenly kingdom here on earth, it was meant to reshape our imaginations. God's wisdom invites us to honor the image of God in every person that we meet. Conflict in relationships is unavoidable. Even with your friends and family, maintaining peace is a struggle. And it's even more difficult with our enemies, people who are out to get us. Right. This is true of any time, at any place in human history. Where there are people, there is strife and violence. And this was definitely true in the time of Jesus, when Roman forces occupied the lands of Israel. So in his teachings, Jesus gives a radical vision for how his followers can seek peace in the midst of this conflict and work to repair even the most difficult relationships. Jesus is an Israelite, and he believes that God's wisdom for relationships is found in the covenant laws given to ancient Israel. And so in these teachings, Jesus will quote from one of those laws and then show the wisdom that's underneath. So Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said to the ancients, 'Do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made.'" Now, in Israel, an oath was a type of promise where you swear by God that you will do what you say. Like if you want to borrow some money, you could swear by God to repay me. Exactly. And you can trust me because in Israel's covenant laws, God requires me to keep my oaths. So oaths are a great way to avoid disputes. You would think so. But even oaths can be twisted to take advantage of people. For example, what if I swear by God's temple that I will repay you? Well, I know the law requires you to honor your oath, so it's a deal. But I didn't exactly swear by God, just my temple. So I'm not really bound to the oath. So you're tricking me into trusting you. Exactly. So Jesus cuts through all of this and says, just don't make oaths at all, by God or by anything else in God's world. Never make a promise to anyone? Not quite. His point is that when you do make a promise, don't use God's reputation as a tool to manipulate people. Right, Jesus says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Being a peacemaker starts with a radical commitment to honesty and integrity. Now, I can see how this works if I started the conflict, but what if someone else starts a conflict with me? Well, the next case study actually gets into exactly that. Jesus quotes from the Torah. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. This is a famous line known as the law of retaliation. Yeah, you harm me, I can harm you back. This kind of sounds like a license for revenge that can get out of hand. Well, actually, this law was designed to limit the amount of retribution you can demand. It should be equal to the amount of harm done, not more. So this law keeps peace by restraining our urge to hurt back those who hurt us. Yes, and Jesus takes the wisdom of this law to a new level, telling his followers, don't even pay back an evil person. Don't retaliate at all? Yes, become people who value peace more than getting even. But letting people get away with evil won't bring peace. You just can't stand by and do nothing. Hold on, Jesus doesn't say do nothing. Rather, he advocates a really bold and creative response to evil that is non-violent, so it can open the door for peace. Now, what does that look like? Well, Jesus gives 3 examples from his own time and place. First, he says, whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to them as well. In the ancient Roman world, a right cheek slap with the back of the right hand was a symbolic way of dominating someone and humiliating them. But Jesus says, don't retaliate. Rather, stand your ground and offer them the left cheek. This will force your attacker to strike with an open right hand. In other words, to strike you like an equal. And it forces them to treat you as a fellow human being. Yes, even if it costs you. Well, next, Jesus says, if anyone sues you and takes your shirt, let him have your coat also. Yeah, in ancient Israel, taking a poor person's coat was against the law because it's also their blanket to keep warm at night. But a really uncaring person could find a way around this by demanding their shirt as payment. Right. So Jesus offers a creative response. Give them your shirt and also give them your coat. Why would you do that? Wouldn't that leave you exposed? Exactly. Jesus is being provocative. The goal is to shock everyone around by exposing this injustice through costly generosity. The third example is, whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2. In Jesus' day, a Roman soldier could force any subject to carry their packs for them up to 1 mile. How humiliating and dangerous. And so Jesus says, carry that load not just 1 mile, but 2. The first mile, he might treat you like a pack animal, but by going that second mile, you assert your humanity as you choose to treat him like a friend. Wait, treat an enemy oppressor like a friend? Yeah, it sounds crazy. But Jesus is saying that bold generosity can subvert the power games of our world and even turn enemies into friends. And that leads to the last law that Jesus quotes. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Jesus is quoting an ancient biblical law when he says, love your neighbor. But then he quotes a popular line that many Israelites added to the law, but you can hate your enemy. Jesus counters this by telling his followers, love your enemies and pray for those who mistreat you. Now, isn't this going a bit far? Peace with my enemies is one thing, but loving them? Yes. Jesus seems to think that true peace is only possible when we treat every human as if they have ultimate value, which means that even my enemy is a fellow image of God. But how am I supposed to love someone who hates me? It's hard enough to love the people that love me. And our love for our friends and our family is a good thing. But for Jesus, that is just the starting point. He challenges his followers to share that same love outside our circles of comfort. And he holds up God's indiscriminate, generous love as the model. Jesus says, God causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. The call is to become peacemakers who are inviting others in, working to mend broken relationships at every level in our communities. It really is a radical way to live. Yes. Jesus calls it becoming complete when he says, be complete just as your heavenly Father is complete. It means imitating God's generosity to both friends and enemies, because for Jesus, creative love is the only pathway to real peace. Jesus of Nazareth, one of the most influential people in history, taught that the truly good life flows out of a close, intimate relationship with the creator of the universe. Yeah, Jesus believed this was the ultimate treasure of human existence, receiving God's love. And Jesus said, doing righteousness is our response by giving that love back out to others. Now, Jesus also lived in a culture where showing your devotion to God publicly will increase your reputation. So, it would be easy to turn your intimacy with God into a performance to get public praise. Exactly. And so, in a group of his teachings called the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus warned his followers about that temptation. Be careful that you don't do your righteousness in front of people for the purpose of being seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in the skies. So, acting like you're close with God might gain you social status or applause, but Jesus says that's really all you're going to get. Jesus describes this performance as being a hypocrite, which comes from the Greek word hypokrites, which refers to a stage actor putting on a show. So how can I know if I'm becoming a hypocrite? I mean, that seems like an easy trap. Yeah, it's super easy. And so Jesus offers 3 case studies. He uses the 3 most common ways in his day that Jewish people expressed their devotion to God, beginning with generosity. So then, when you give generously to those in need, don't signal it with a trumpet, as the hypocrites do in the town squares or streets. They do that to be honored by people. And I tell you the truth, they have fully received their reward. So, in Jesus' culture, public displays of generosity were a way to celebrate God's generous love. But they could also become a way to promote yourself. So Jesus offers an alternative. When you give generously to those in need, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving is done privately. And your Father who sees what is done in private, he will fully reward you. So one foolproof way to make sure your generosity is really done out of love is to do it in ways other people can't see. But didn't Jesus also teach to let your light and good deeds shine as an example for others? Well, yes. When you consider all of Jesus' teachings on generosity, we see he regularly called his followers to give generously because it displays the heartbeat of God's love. But be careful and self-critical, he says. If there's even a hint of inner hypocrisy, it's probably wise to do your giving in private. It would be easier if Jesus just gave one clear rule. Maybe, but what he's given us is wisdom. And that forces us to cultivate a closer relationship with God, trusting that he'll show us when to give in private or more publicly. He makes the same point in his second case study about prayer. And when you pray, don't be like the hypocrites who love to pray while standing where people gather or on street corners so that they can be seen by people. I tell you the truth, they have fully received their reward. In Jesus' culture, most Jewish people stopped whatever they were doing multiple times a day, and they prayed a traditional prayer from the Torah, called the Shema. Jesus himself was known for his consistent devotion to prayer. But be careful, he says, because even your prayer habits can become a strategy for public praise. Right, I can imagine the temptation to conveniently find yourself on a busy street corner when prayer time comes. And people will think, I'm really devout. And if that's what you're after, congratulations. You will probably get people's admiration. But that's all. So Jesus suggests a different way. But when you pray, go into a room, shut the door, so you can pray to your Father in private. And your Father, who can see what's done in private, he will reward you. Prayer is about spending time with God, sharing your thoughts and concerns, and trusting that he will hear and respond. The easiest way to check your motives for praying is to do it when no one can see. But again, this is not a rule, it's wisdom. Jesus prayed alone and also together with his followers. Both are important ways of connecting to God. The third example Jesus gives is about fasting. When you all fast, don't look gloomy like the hypocrites. They make their faces look disfigured so their fasting will be seen by others. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward. So fasting is a way of praying with your body by withholding your own physical needs like food and drink, and then inviting God's presence to meet you in that place of need. But even fasting can be used as a performance. Yes, so be careful. Like Jesus says, but when you fast, anoint your head with oil, wash your face, so your fasting isn't visible to anyone except your Father in private, and He will reward you. Now, notice that in all three cases, Jesus does not say to ditch these practices. Right, express your devotion, but find creative ways to do it so that you don't treat God's love like a trophy. Jesus knows that His followers will be most effective in the world when they care the least about their social standing, because their ultimate goal is simply to know and be known by the God generous love. Jesus of Nazareth was a first-century Jewish man who claimed that he was uniting God's domain above with our domain below. He called this the arrival of God's kingdom. Jesus invited people to follow him so they could enter into that heavenly realm here on earth in their day-to-day lives. And that's what he's talking about in the collection of teachings called the Sermon on the Mount. Now, if you really believed that God's heavenly life was available here and now, that would change your perspective on just about everything, including your possessions. In fact, Jesus said the biggest obstacle to experiencing God's heavenly life and presence is our stuff. The word Jesus uses literally means the stored up things. So, our storage. Okay. Yeah, some people do have a lot of stuff, but it's natural to collect things. Stuff can make life easier. Stuff can give me security. Stuff gives me freedom. Well, we think that it does, but Jesus says not so much. Don't store up your stuff on the way, where moths and nibblers destroy and where thieves break in and steal. Okay, but what if I just protect my stuff? All right, but now your attention is going to be on keeping your stuff safe. Jesus says the good life comes when our attention is directed elsewhere. Store up for yourselves the stuff of the sky. Sky stuff? What's this sky stuff? Well, it's a kind of stuff that is so secure that it can't ever be threatened. And it's different from our stuff here on earth. It's the stuff that God's heavenly kingdom is made of. And the more you collect it, the more you'll experience that kingdom here on earth. All right, how do I get that kind of stuff? Well, Jesus said that we can experience God's heavenly kingdom now, when we love God and love our neighbor. It's that rich experience of peace and fulfillment, those moments when heaven and earth unite when we follow the teachings of Jesus, like a kind word or an act of generosity, offering forgiveness and showing compassion. Yes, store up that kind of stuff, because the loving relationships that we cultivate now will last into the renewed creation. And what we store up has a way of slowly shaping us in its image, for better or worse. Or, as Jesus puts it, where your stored up things are, there too will be your hearts. Okay, so I should focus my hopes and desires on what really matters. Right. In fact, next Jesus uses a vivid image to describe this focus. The layup of the body is the eye. So then, if your eye is good, your whole body will be radiant. This phrase, good eye, is the figure of speech in the Hebrew Bible for being really generous, while a bad eye is a metaphor for being stingy, hoarding your stuff. Jesus warns that a bad eye is the quickest way to ruin yourself. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be dark. If the light that is in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? Yikes. So maybe I should give away all my stuff. Maybe Jesus once told a wealthy man to do just that. Ultimately, it's about our priorities. Here, Jesus tells a parable. No one is able to serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You are not able to serve God and wealth. Wealth is like a tyrant that demands our loyalty. I might think I own my stuff, but before long, my stuff will own me. And this danger is real. And so Jesus is pretty blunt. Our stuff can prevent us from experiencing the union of heaven and earth in our lives. Okay. But let's be real. I need things to survive. I need food. I need clothes. Well, Jesus has one final teaching about our stuff that brings all these ideas together. He invites us to consider how God has packed creation with abundance, each creature having just what it needs. Jesus says that if you trust God as a generous Father and prioritize loving God and loving others, you will find that your needs are met. And you'll find the rich peace of heaven and earth uniting in your own life. I say to you all, don't worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, not even about your body, what you'll put on. Isn't life more than food and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air, how they don't sow seed, and they don't harvest, and they don't gather into barns, and yet your Father in the skies feeds them. Aren't you much more valuable than they are? And who among you is able to add an hour to your life by worrying? And about clothing, why are you all so worried? Pay attention to the lilies of the field, how they grow. They don't labor, and they don't weave cloth. But I tell you all, not even Solomon in all his glory clothed himself like one of these. Now if the grass of the field, which is there today and tomorrow is tossed into the furnace, is clothed this way by God, won't he make sure to clothe you all who have so little trust? So then don't be worried, saying, what will we eat? Or what will we drink? Or what will we wear for clothing? For the nations constantly seek for all this stuff. For your Father in the skies knows that you need all this. Rather, first, seek for the kingdom of God, and do right by God, and all these things will be added to you. So then, don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow can worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Jesus called his followers to live with radical generosity, to be peacemakers who love their enemies, and to hunger and thirst for right relationships. Jesus called this way of life a greater righteousness, because it fulfills God's will for his people that's expressed in Israel's scriptures, the Torah and prophets. But in this section of his teachings called Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gives some warnings about potential traps along the way. Traps? Yeah. For example, when you spend a lot of time studying God's wisdom in Scripture, it's easy to start thinking of yourself more highly than you should, ignoring your own blind spots. And it can feel natural to start handing out God's wisdom to others when you think they need it here. So the earnest quest for doing good could lead to a lack of self-awareness and a judgmental attitude. Exactly. That's why Jesus opens his teachings on this topic by bluntly saying, do not judge. Well, that's a way to avoid the trap, I guess, but it's not easy when I see other people living foolishly. Jesus invites us to take our instinct to judge others and instead empathize with them. How would I want to be judged if I were in their place? What standard would I like to be measured by? Well, I'd like to be judged fairly, for a start. Right. The problem is we're often unaware of our own character flaws and of the biases that can distort how we see others. This is why Jesus continues with a well-known parable. Why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but you don't notice the beam in your own eye? Jesus takes that impulse to judge others and he redirects it as an opportunity for critical self-reflection. Okay, so if I see someone who I think is being angry and I feel like judging them, I take that as a chance to reflect on my own issues with things. Right. Or, as Jesus says, first take the beam out of your own eye, and then you can see clearly the speck in your brother's eye. Okay, so let's say I've dealt with my issues. Now it's time to remove that speck. Maybe. Jesus doesn't actually give us a formula for what to do next. But if I notice that a person's choices are clearly hurting them, I should help them, right? Not always. Sometimes people are not in a place to receive them. Offering God's wisdom will only make them angry, so it's actually unwise. Jesus uses the riddle to make this point. Do not give what is holy to dogs, and don't throw your pearls in front of pigs. Jesus is drawing on an idea from the biblical Proverbs. Don't correct a fool, or you could become like them. Wait, so leave people to ruin themselves? Not necessarily. Sometimes you should step in and help. That same proverb continues, correct a fool according to his folly, for he'll be wise in his own eyes. So knowing when or when not to get involved requires discernment. So it takes wisdom to know when to offer wisdom. Exactly. And God loves to give wisdom. So Jesus says we should cultivate the habit of asking for it. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock, and it will be opened for you. For everyone who asks will receive, and the one who seeks will find. And to the one who knocks, it will be opened. The God of the Bible is like a generous parent. Even bad parents still want what is best for their children. And how much more, Jesus says, will our Heavenly Father give good gifts to His children when they ask? And the gift we need from God is more wisdom. Now, Jesus ends this section of teaching with one of His most memorable wisdom sayings. Everything you desire that people would do to you, so you should do to them. When God's wisdom feels far off and life is way too complicated, start with empathy for the other. How would I like to be treated? And how would I want others to offer God's wisdom to me? Well, I would want to be treated with kindness, with patience. And ultimately, I just want to know that I'm loved. So start there. And then continue with every ounce of wisdom that our generous God gives you.